Okay.
I don't know. Oh, okay. Oh, why don't I know how to do this? I don't know. Maybe better go back again. I thought I heard him say okay.
He did.
Join from PC. Join here. Passcode Pit Zoom. Or iPhone. Passcode is Pit Zoom. Okay, let's try again.
Okay, let's try that again. I apologize. My camera was doing something funky there. I can always blame it on one of my devices. So today it was the camera. Didn't want to behave. Oh, and still not quite doing the right thing. 1 second here. Still doing something funky. Give me 1 more second here. Okay, I believe now we finally got it. I do apologize for the technical issues there. I think we got everything worked out. Camera was misbehaving, and we are now ready to rumble. So I apologize for the slightly late start. Please forgive me. And with no further ado, we will get rolling. So first of all, I'd like to welcome all of you here tonight to our series, the 6th installment of Righteous Converts, True Religion. Tonight we were talking about the British aristocrat, Lord George Gordon. And I did promise you all that our last few sessions, which are tonight, is the second to last session. Next week will be our final session. And with these last few sessions, we are telling two absolutely crazy stories. So, with no further ado, we will delve right in because we're getting a few minutes late start here. And hey, we'll tell you the story and we'll rock and we'll roll. So let's just delve right in. So tonight's story is about Lord George Gordon. Now, we're essentially talking about the same time period that we discussed last week. Lord George Gordon was essentially a contemporary of the Garrett Tzedek, Valentin Potocki that we spoke about last week. If you missed it, you can get on TorahAnytime.com where you can get all of our wonderful lectures. And but they were essentially contemporaries from different parts of the world. We have no indication at all that they knew each other, and I would probably assume that they did not know each other. But be it as it may, we're going to see they have a somewhat similar story, and in some ways similar, and in many ways very, very different. So the time period we're starting in is the mid-18th century. 1751 was the year that Lord Gordon passed away. I'm sorry, Lord Gordon was born, which if we go with our earliest possible date of when Potocki from last week passed away, that was 1749. So they for sure didn't even live at the same time. But there's other dates of that. Anyways, so George Gordon was born on December 26, 1751, and he was of such British aristocratic stock that King George II was his godfather at his baptism. His father was a part of the British royalty. His mother was part of the British aristocracy. And he was really just your typical British aristocratic family member. That's what we're talking about. Now, if you're into good old British historical fictions and you read Charles Dickens, I myself am not so into Charles Dickens, and just by a show of hands, has anybody ever read the book Barnaby's Rouge? Just by a show of hands, anyone, either through the Zoom hand or if your video's on, you can do it through the other one. Barnaby's Rouge. So Barnaby Rouge was a historical fiction, like most of Charles Dickens' books, and is actually based on the life and times of George Gordon, somewhat. So born into real aristocracy, he graduated, and he's known from a young age of being quite a prodigy. And he actually graduates from school at the age of 12, and he is able to enter straight into the Royal Navy at the age of 12. And now, by this point, his father had passed away. His mother had remarried also into another British aristocratic family. And his stepfather surely pulled strings to be able to have such a young, precocious boy go into the Navy and, of course, go in with, with a certain amount of position, a certain amount of colors already. And that's where he found himself at 12 years of age. Now, you would think that a little 12-year-old from an aristocratic family who, based on family favors, is able to make his way into the Navy and to have a position of note in the Navy, you would think that such a person, so to speak, would have a sweet life in the Navy, would have it easy and just that would be what he would do. But that is not the case at all, actually. We see that the life that he ends up leading in the Navy is quite different than you would expect, and much to the chagrin of his compatriots, much to the chagrin of his other aristocratic family members, he actually became a spokesman in the Army, a spokesman, if you will, of the lower class seamen, of the poor living conditions in the Navy, the poor food that they were served in the Navy, and he actually appealed to Earl of Sandwich, to get better living conditions for these sailors in the Navy. Now, Lord Sandwich did not want to. Now, but at that point, Lord Sandwich was the head of the Navy, and at that point, he didn't want to hear anything about this. They were Britain was already very much entangled in the American, what became known as the American Revolutionary War, and they didn't want to hear anything about better living conditions for the better living conditions for the soldiers. So be it as it may, that was already Gordon at an early point in his life starting to make some enemies. And, the famous person who stole the name Sandwich. And I say stole the name because really we invented the sandwich with the Passover offering long before Earl came around. And it should really be called the Passover sandwich, or maybe the Hill sandwich or something like that. But be as it may, they call it Earl of Sandwich. In 1772, Gordon resigns his commission in the army based on the fact that he can't deal with the living conditions for the soldiers that are not of aristocracy like him, and he can't get a hearing with anyone who'll do anything different. So in protest, he leaves the Navy. 1774, at the age of 22, after his naval career, he begins a political career, and he starts lobbying. To become an MP, a member of parliament, and he is challenging an incumbent who's been there for a long time, as was the case in 18th century British politics, and is still the case in many places today. The particular MP whom he was challenging had bought his position and was not about to give it up to this upstart that was gaining popularity in his campaigning. So the MP whom he was challenging talked to his father and had him buy a different position in the parliament for George. And sure enough, just like that, at the age of 22 in 1774, George Gordon becomes Lord George Gordon, makes his way into the British Parliament, and from day one, starts to show his precocious skills, but he also shows that he is not a fan of the parliamentary system. Now, what system am I referring to? The system of the parliamentary parties. He from day one, he has no interest of joining a party, and basically, he was an issue-based politician. And as we all know, as politics go, being an issue-based politician is not always a popular place to be, and he often couldn't successfully get anything done in the parliament, as he was not accepted in any coalition, didn't join any party, and did not have such an illustrious political career. Is not known for any great pieces of legislation. In the 1700s, before he was born, in the decade before he was born, it was a very interesting time for Britain, to say the least. This was the time period of Oliver Cromwell, who Oliver Cromwell overthrows the British monarchy, exiles the British monarchy, and promises a parliamentary system, promises a democratic system in Britain. Now, for those of us who know anything about world history, British history, we know that Cromwell ended up being, in many ways, more fanatical, more radical than the king was himself, and didn't live very long. And when his son took over, his son was overthrown, and they invited the king back to England, but developed the situation that really is very similar to what we have today, where there is a, this constitutional monarchy, a limited monarchy, where now it's basically an impotent monarchy. But that's the situation that really started at the time of Oliver Cromwell. Now, there are several other things done at the time of Oliver Cromwell that are more significant to us, or more significant to our discussion tonight. One is that in 1655, Oliver Cromwell let the Jews back into England. They had been expelled in the 13th century. And interestingly enough, at the same time, there was enacted in Britain anti-Catholic laws. There are many. There's a whole anti-Catholic set of legislation that was put into place where Catholics were not given the freedoms in the country that others were given. The Protestants were given because it was a Protestant country, and so here you had this interesting dichotomy going on. That on one hand, the Jews are allowed back into the country, but on the other hand, the Catholics are being essentially oppressed in the country, and their civil rights are completely taken away. Now, by the 18th century, when our friend George Gordon is in the parliament, you have legislation that is passed in 1778, the Catholic Relief Act, or the Papal Relief Act, to essentially start to give rights back to the Catholic community of England. Now, the language was very mild and as to not upset the Protestants. But essentially what it did is it removed the threat of life imprisonment from Catholic priests who celebrated Mass in England, and for the clergy and the lay Catholics who kept and taught Catholic schools. It also took away life imprisonment for them, and it also removed the restrictions on buying, holding, and inheriting real property, conditional upon swearing a specific oath of allegiance. So basically, the Catholics could once again own property if they would swear allegiance to the king, and the public practice of Catholicism was no longer punished by life imprisonment. And that was the Catholic Relief Act of 1778. Now, George Gordon, a good Protestant boy. Now at this point, he's roughly 26 years old. He is not a fan of this legislation at all, at all. He believes, now he doesn't necessarily believe that there's a problem with the Catholic religion in of itself, but from what he's seen from Catholic monarchies and Catholic rule throughout the world, he is worried that that is a source of Catholicism, that's sourced in Catholicism, and that if Catholics are allowed to be an equal part of the British Empire, they will plot an overthrow of the British Empire, and the sort of democratic situation that Britain has fought so hard for will cease to exist, and it'll go back to being the monarchy that it was 100 years ago. So his drive in being anti-Catholic was a drive against the papal rule and the monarchical rule that Catholic countries represented. And to this end, Gordon is appointed in 1779 as the president of the United Protestant Association of Scotland and England. And in that role, he begins a campaign to overturn the Catholic Relief Act of 1778, of the year before. And his mission is that the Roman Catholics must know, as well as we do, that aid by government has always been dangerous to the liberties of the people. Again, that was his position, that Catholicism was a threat to the liberties of the people because it represented the monarchies of the past, the archaic monarchies that he didn't want in England anymore. That's what he was motivated by. And he had statements like no government, not Roman Catholic, ought to tolerate popery. The term is popery, having the Pope rule. That was something that he was totally, absolutely against. And to that end, he tried to overturn the Catholic Relief Act of 1778. Now, his approach was 100% what we would call politics, diplomacy, diplomatics. That's what he practiced at this point. And for the next year, he lobbied his fellow members of parliament. He got at least 4 audiences with the king. He had petitions circulated throughout England. And in those petitions, he got tens of thousands of signatures, tens of thousands of Catholic Brits that did not want Protestants to have the freedoms that they were being given, lest they plan a rebellion and overthrow the government. So essentially what Gordon was advocating for was an apartheid state. He wasn't advocating that the Catholics should be kicked out of England. He just thought they should be second-class citizens. They shouldn't have the rights of citizenship because there's a fear they would overthrow the government. Okay. Now, our fateful time begins, June 2nd, 1780. He's roughly a year into his cause of trying to overturn the Catholic Relief Act of 1778, and to no avail so far. When he was in his audiences with the king, he used all the chutzpah in the world, and the king would claim his act to parliament. He said, but I'm in parliament, I'm trying over there too. And it was, you know, he had essentially burnt every political bridge that he had at that point. And at this point, he has the the signatures of over 40,000 Brits who on they have signed on to a petition to say that the Catholic Relief Act should be overturned in Parliament. Okay, so at this point, lobbying hasn't worked, talking to the king hasn't worked, the signing of the petition alone hasn't worked. So on June 2nd, 1780, George Gordon plans a march on Washington. I mean, a march on London, right? He plans a march on the Parliament. He encourages all of the 40,000 plus signatories to his petition to march on march on London, march on the House of Commons, march on Parliament. And again, in no way is he trying to incite riot. Everything, if recorded of the Times from his statements and everything that he said, was all about, let's show them our numbers. We're going to march to Parliament. We're going to demand that they accept our petition, and we're going to demand that it be passed. By the way, just throwing this out here, as all of you know, this series that we are in right now was scheduled weeks ago. This topic was not picked last week. It was picked weeks ago. It just happens to be that the story sounds very familiar for what happened in this country last week. But be it as it may, essentially how you saw things play out last week in Washington is how things played out in London on June 2nd, 1780. Because while Gordon himself, as a member of Parliament, was advocating to just be a protest, to just show the powers of the petition, and he walked in to deliver the petition into Parliament, he insisted that there be a vote upon it. And in the meantime, what was happening outside is the numbers of protesters had grown from 40,000 to 50,000 to 60,000. And all of a sudden, it wasn't just people screaming no popery, but that's not no popery. They had no problem with popery. It was popery, right? They didn't want the Pope. And they were, it had changed from the civil protesters, the peaceful demonstrators that Gordon had encouraged to be there, to all kinds of people who just had gripes with the government, all kinds of people who didn't like what the Parliament was doing, all kinds of people that didn't like that the monarchy was still too involved, all kinds of people with all kinds of causes that were anti-government. And as the situation started to deteriorate, you had upwards of 60,000 people, many of them not even part of Gordon's cause. And in the meantime, Gordon is going back and forth to the halls of the House of the Commons, coming out to the steps to report to the masses as to what was going on. And eventually he was informed that his voice had been heard, and then no action would be taken until several days later, until 4 days later. And the Parliament urged the crowd to leave and to beware of any mischief. So at that point, George said, okay, they've heard our numbers, they've heard our voice, we're on the agenda, everybody go home. Okay, that's what he said, everybody go home. Gehen Gesundheit, right, go home, everyone have a good evening. And everything from George's words indicate that everything was a peaceful demonstration, and that's what he was encouraging. Now, that night, a group of rowdy protesters who had been protesting in front of the House of Commons start the destruction that became part of these riots. And there were several Catholic institutions that were attacked throughout England. Now, on Tuesday, 4 days later, on June 6th, when the House of Parliament, the House of Commons, the Parliament finally reconvened to vote on Gordon's proposal, on Gordon's petition, they ignored the petition, and instead they voted to denounce the rioting and the destruction that had been committed on the chapels and on the subjects of the majesty. And there was a promise that these people would have to pay back the damage that they did. And at that point, things really start to go out of control, because those who were in favor of this petition being passed were now very upset because the House of Commons essentially didn't hear the petition like they thought they would. And all those who just upset the government took their opportunity to air their grievances. And on June 7th, all Gehenna, all heck breaks loose, and many Roman Catholic buildings are destroyed, pillaged, private dwelling of Catholics are set fire to, are destroyed, are looted and plundered. The Newgate prison, where until this point, in the past few days of these protests, all of the protesters who had been arrested, they were kept as prisoners in the Newgate prison. The prison was set afire. The prison was broke open to let all of the prisoners out. There was an attack on the Bank of England. At this point, the king calls in his army because things had gotten completely out of hand. Now, just to show again where Gordon's mindset is, at one point, Gordon, being protected by some of the protesters turned rioters, says to his protectors, he says, "For God's sake, go home. While you behave, weigh nothing, and your petition can be compiled with. The House will never consent to it." Basically saying, stop what you're doing. This isn't going to further our cause at all. But he was completely ignored. And on June 7th, the king brings in 10,000 troops to put down the insurrection, to put down the rioters. George himself was arrested and taken to the Tower and arrested on charges of high treason. In those 6 days, 285 rioters were killed, 100 by first police and then by the army. 173 were injured, 450 were arrested, 160 were tried, 62 were condemned to death, 25 were hanged, actually ended up being hanged. About 40,000 pounds of damages were assessed. That's about $1 million in today's American dollars. And that is the situation that befell what was in many ways the greatest civil disturbance ever in the history of Great Britain. Now, interestingly enough, as Gordon is sitting in jail for almost 9 months, there's a lot of pieces of evidence we can look at as to his case, not the least of which is not one of the 44,000 signatures that he had on his petition were amongst the 450 arrested. So at least the 450 that were caught, arrested for being rioters, not one of them was a signatory on the original petition, which again shows that in many ways the original goals of Gordon were to just take his lobbying one step further, peaceful protesting, but many other people in the British government, in the British Commonwealth and England and Great Britain that were not happy with the situation took the advantage to air their grievances on the British government, to air their grievances on their Catholic co-countrymen. And that is what happened on June 7th. Gordon now finds himself in jail, awaiting trial for high treason. Okay, at this point, I'm going to pause just to see if there's any questions, any points that we've been unclear on. Any questions, either type them into the chat box or go ahead and speak them out if your microphone or camera are on.
Were Jews allowed to own property at that time?
So I don't recall exactly when Jews were allowed to own property. We're going to talk a little bit more about the Jews in England in a moment. I think they were allowed, when they were allowed back into the country in the 1700s, it was with full rights. I'm pretty sure that was Menashe ben Solomon and his lobbying over Cromwell. And I'm pretty sure it was full rights that they were allowed into the country with. So I can fact check that when we're done, but that's what I believe is the case. Okay, any other questions at this point? Okay. By the way, if your questions pop up as we are moving along, feel free to type them in the chat box, and we'll get to them when we pause for questions. So, for a moment before we deal with Gordon's trial, let's look at what led to such a mass hysteria, a mass protest. Like we said, the largest civil disturbance ever to happen in England, in the history of the country, the history of the Commonwealth, or the history of the monarchy for sure. So what led to it? So number one, the whole thing was the whole rebellion, if we'll call it, or insurrection, or whatever term you want to use, was three-tiered. Number one, as we mentioned, was the political approach that Gordon was taking. He tried petition didn't work. He tried marching. He tried call for repeal. He sought all these levels, but all the lobbying had no effect. So that's why he calls together this mass protest. But that was on the political level, and that was what he was striving for. The second level was a tendency in Britain at that time of Protestant nationalistic populism. that again, the Protestant ideals was the idea of being a nationalistic country, a Protestant nationalistic country. So a lot of those who were rebelling both against the country, which was a Protestant country, and the government was a Protestant government, but they also took out their wrath on the Catholic institutions because that went against the grain as their nationalistic, their Protestant nationalistic populism that they were pushing for. And the third was just, I think, what we often see in these cases is that anytime there's any type of insurrection, you know, the retaliation against authority takes any opportunity to retaliate. You know, it doesn't matter what the cause is. That when they're rioting, you know, it doesn't matter if you agree with it, you don't agree with it. You know, I'm upset at the government. I'm upset at the man. I'm upset at the establishment. I'm upset. I'm a downtrodden Brit, you know, and therefore I'm going to fight back. I don't care what the cause is. So it was probably all three of these levels that led to such a massive protest and riot in England. Now, what happens to Gordon? Gordon was very lucky because being of British noble aristocracy, had many friends in high places. And one of those friends was none other than Lord Erskine, who was a very famous lawyer in Britain. And he took on the case of Gordon's, of defending Gordon, his case against the government, of being tried for high treason. And he put together a brilliant summation of the situation that led to Gordon's acquittal. He explained how what Gordon was trying to do was purely political, how at no point did he have motivations of treason, at no point did he have motivations of acts of violence, that was all this, you know, the riffraff that got involved. You know, many might feel that his words encouraged, incited, promoted civil disobedience and disturbances, but bottom line is, to make someone guilty of treason, argued Lord Erskine, it has to be that they have motivations of treason. And George Gordon, clearly had no motivations of treason, no signs of treason. He cared deeply about the country. He was a minister of the parliament. And this was the case that Erskine put forward for his friend Gordon. And sure enough, Gordon is acquitted. He is let out of prison. And what does Gordon do? Well, what both his family and the king and the prime minister, who at this point is Pitt the Elder, I think one of the best names of any prime ministers of all of England, of all of the history of Britain, but they all hope that he'll basically go away, that this will be the end of him. Instead, he does the complete opposite. Okay, what happens now is Lord George Gordon becomes an advocate for essentially every liberal cause he could find. In other words, any cause that was going against the government, any cause of the downtrodden in Britain, he took on that cause. And he became a voluminous writer. He had voluminous correspondences between the upper echelons of government and the different downtrodden different downtrodden parties. And he took up many causes in these times, cause of liberty. He essentially became the ACLU of Britain at that time, right? Fighting for all the civil causes of all types of downtrodden people, all types of civil liberty cases. Now, this did not exactly help him with his relationship with the government, because England in the mid-18th century, now we're towards the end of the 18th century, you know, they don't want to be called out for their lack of liberty to some of the British subjects. I mean, you have to remember what's going on in the world at this point. I mean, they just lost the Revolutionary War in America. We had the French Revolution not so far down the road. We have, or at least Napoleon's revolution not so far down the road. We got all these things going on in the world. Britain doesn't want any of that. And now you have this very vocal, popular member of the aristocracy who's taking up every liberal cause in the country, every cause of liberty in the country, and therefore is just exacerbating the situations that they were just fighting against in what is now America. The situation that's going on in France, the situation that's already gone in Scotland. Scotland's already past this. And therefore, suffice it to say, the powers that be, the man, is not happy with Gordon at this time. Gordon is once again arrested. He is tried for libel against the government, against the prime minister, against all of these powers that be, against Marie Antoinette, against everyone. And this time he's found guilty. But because of just the situation that was going on, he was able to flee before he was ever sentenced. So he runs away. He runs away from England, and essentially the warrant goes out for his arrest because he's a convicted felon now who just hasn't been sentenced, and he runs first to first to France, and the French government insisted that he go back to Britain. They didn't want him in their country. First to Holland, then to France. And both countries, both the Netherlands and both France, did not want him in their country because they didn't want to mess up their connection, their ties, their diplomacy with Britain. And eventually he goes back to Britain because he couldn't find a safe haven anywhere in the world. And he goes to secretly hide out in Birmingham. By the way, it's Birmingham of the United Kingdom, not Birmingham, Alabama, where they're probably very happy today based on the football game last night that a lot of Ohioans are not so happy about. But he hides out in Birmingham, the original Birmingham that Birmingham, Alabama is named for. By the way, there's not a lot of similarities between Birmingham, Alabama and Birmingham, England. But be it as it may, that's where he hides out. And he's able to hide out there for quite some time, for a number of years, before he is discovered. I'm sorry, not for a number of years, for 7 months. He's able to hide out there for 7 months, but this was after a number of years of fleeing, first to Holland, then to France, and eventually coming back to Great Britain to hide out in Birmingham. He's able to successfully hide out in Birmingham for a total of 7 months before he is eventually discovered, and the warrant for his arrest goes out, and it's discovered that it's him. By the way, the year now is 1787. So this is 7 years, roughly 6-7 years after he is found guilty. And the officers of the king, the officers of parliament, come to Dudley Street, which is a poor neighborhood in Birmingham, and they're looking for Gordon, and they go to where they are told Gordon has been hiding, and out comes a man with a broad-brimmed Hasidic hat with a long beard and long payas, a long frock, a long kaputta. And they ask him, "Are you George Gordon?" And he says, "I used to be. Now my name is Yisroel ben Avraham. I am now a Jew." Okay? Now, let me just give you some pictures. A picture speaks 1,000 words. Let's just see who we're talking about here and what he looks like. This is a portrait of Gordon when he was still George Gordon. This is a portrait of what Gordon looks like when he is captured and taken back to Parliament to be sentenced. Okay, same face, I guess, but you got the payas, you got what they call the Hasidic bibahut, you got the frock. This guy is full-blown super Jew. That's what they find. So they're shocked, right? That is, while they've been looking all over the world for this guy, the last thing they expected was to find George Gordon turned Yisroel ben Avraham, now a Jew. So what exactly happened? What's the story here? Right? What happened in the 7 years or 6 or 7 years that Gordon was running away from the British government for the 7 months he's in Britain? What in the world was happening here? So interestingly enough, we do not have a lot of writings from Gordon. A lot of these are from conversations that happened with Gordon and different articles that were written, and trying to piece together exactly what happened. It seems that, as we mentioned, Gordon's issue with the Catholics was not religious in nature. It was political in nature. And even as a young man, he questioned Protestantism. He questioned Catholicism. He questioned the idea of Jesus as the Messiah, as God, or the Trinity, or whatever, the difference between, how the Protestants look at it. And he always questioned it. Not only that, but one of the big differences we discussed last week between Catholicism and Protestantism is that Catholicism does not believe in reading the Bible, whereas Protestantism does. So similar to our story last week with Patutsky with the Ger Tzedek, as a young man, he started reading the Bible, as was encouraged by Protestants. He started to ask questions. He said, 1 second, right? The same questions always hear Converse asking. It says here there's one God. What are you doing talking about Jesus? It says here we're supposed to keep kosher. Why aren't you keeping kosher? And he started to ask these questions as a young man. And therefore, when he was now there's the story that was told in England, and there's what is most likely the reality. The story that was told in England is that all this was at least initially was a facade just to try and hide out from the government, right? No better way to hide out from the government than pretend you're a Hasidic Jew, right? No better way to hide. It's like a stranger among us, right? Well, I think he was a Hasidic Jew in that movie, but whatever, right? No better way to hide out than pretend that you're a Hasidic Jew. What everyone's going to see is by the end of his life, they realize that doesn't hold water because he is very sincere. If it was all just a way to hide from the government, then when he eventually goes to prison, he would no longer be a Jew. But we're going to see he remains a very sincere Jew, which leads historians to the theory of what happened is he already believed in Judaism for quite some time. Now, as we mentioned last week, England was not a place where you could convert to Judaism at this time, because while the Jews were emancipated in England, part of the agreement in 1655, when Oliver Cromwell let the Jews back into the country, was that Jews would not proselytize, was that Jews would not convert Protestants to become Jews. So therefore, as much as Gordon might have been interested in becoming a Jew earlier in his life, it was not possible. That's why some historical records write that he converted while he was in Birmingham, but I don't think it's true because I don't think he could have converted when he was in Birmingham. But be it as it may, that is likely why he fled the country, because he knew he was going to jail. He knew he was going to be in jail the rest of his life, more than likely, and he wanted to go to jail as a Jew. So he fled to Holland. If you remember from last week, where did the Ger Tzedek do his conversion? Roughly probably 40 years before this, he did it in Holland, because Amsterdam, Holland was the only country in Europe at that point where a Jew could convert to Judaism. And as we talked about last week, that when non-Jews wanted to convert to Judaism, they went to Holland. And sure enough, that was one of the stops that Gordon took on his exile from Britain, trying to run away from the government. So at least the opinion of this Barstool historian is that it was there in Holland when he converted. Others say it did happen when he came back to Birmingham, because at that point he'd already proved how sincere he was. So the rabbi agreed to convert him, even though it was against the law. Okay, be it as it may, sometime in his exile he converts. And the reason seemingly is that he wants to die as a Jew. He wants to make sure that when he's in jail as a Jew. Okay, so Yisroel ben Avraham Gordon is brought back to England, and he is condemned to 5 years in prison in the Newgate prison, which was not a very pleasant place to be. Now, 5 years in prison, so he's 36 years old. He should be there till 36, 37. He should be there till he's 41, 42, about my age. Now, just to put things into perspective, one of his fellow inmates at the Newgate prison was somebody by the name of Thomas Tonley McCann, who was sentenced and found guilty of setting the king's bench afire, trying to set fire to the property of the king. And he only got a 3-month sentence for attempting to set the king's bench afire. So here you have somebody who really does something directly against the king, trying to harm the king physically. He only gets 3 months in prison. And all of a sudden you have Gordon, who is guilty of libel, of essentially writing, and in his writings are speaking out against the government. He is given 5 years in prison. Now, was it because he's a Jew at this point? Was it because of how embarrassing it was for everyone that this British nobleman was now a Jew? Could be. And we've seen that time and time again in history, in modern history. I mean, one of the, the happy events that's happened in the past few months is the fact that Jonathan Pollard was finally pardoned. Jonathan Pollard was an American citizen, guilty of espionage, guilty of spying for Israel, an ally. And again, such a person should go to jail. Such a person should be found guilty. But never in the history of America did anyone with a similar crime have a sentence like Pollard got. Thank God, the sentence was communed or pardoned. I forget which one. He's now in the land of Israel. Another one is Shlomo Rabashkin. Shlomo Rabashkin, again, did things wrong. I'm not gonna argue it. There are things he was guilty of. But if you look at the case, again, the sentence far outweighed the crime, and he got a sentence that was not equivalent to what other people guilty of the same thing got. And, you know, in these type of situations, you have to start to say, why is this Jew getting such a tough sentence when the other guy, and we're talking 10-fold, 20-fold, 30-fold, when the other guy who did the same thing did not get the same sentence. And that's when we have to, you know, it schmecks a little, it smells a little of anti-Semitism at that point. By the way, Rabashkin was also communed, and he is a free man today. Okay, but be it as it may, that's what seemingly happened to Yisroel ben Avraham Gordon. Part of his fine is that he has to pay £10,000 for his own security. He has to pay £2,500 for his own certies, and that's just the financial burden that comes on him for his sentence. Now, what does Gordon do while he's in prison? As we mentioned before, his acts in prison show that no, anti-Gordon Brit could make a claim that he was just converting to Judaism, trying to hide out from the government, because his whole time in prison, he serves the full 5-year sentence, and he the whole time lives as a very sincere Jew. And the government, the prison, to a certain extent, lets him live as a Jew in prison. He's allowed to put on talis and tefillin every day. He is given kosher food. And not only that, but this is, kind of an amazing thing. He's allowed to have a minyan on Shabbos. So on Shabbos, he's allowed to have 9 other Jews join him in his cell, which he made into a makeshift synagogue. And he could have a minyan on Shabbos. So he lives his whole 5 years in prison as a sincere Jew, as a frum Jew. And not only that, but he was allowed visitors, and he's still very popular and causes a civil liberty. He gets a lot of visitors for people who are downtrodden throughout Britain, wanting to take his advice, wanting to seek his counsel. And he said he would accept visitors, any non-Jew who wanted to visit him. He accepted, but for a Jew to visit him, he had to have a beard and he had to wear a yarmulke. He had to have a head covering. So, he wouldn't have accepted me as a visitor, right? In other words, he would only accept religious Jews as visitors. He did not want to hear from any of what we call from that time the maskilim, the quote unquote emancipated Jews. He had no patience for them. He did not want to hear from them. He wasn't going to help them. And for the most part, those were the Jews involved in these liberal causes and the causes of civil liberty. The right-wing black hat Orthodox, fanatics of England were not so into the liberal causes. But the Jews who were already thrown off the yoke of the Torah, had already thrown away Jewish observance, who had bought into the Jewish Haskalah, the enlightened Judaism, them he had no patience for. He would not meet with them at all the whole time he was in prison. After his 5-year sentence, he has to go before some sort of a parole board before he is allowed to be a free man. And in that situation, he has to swear some sort of oath of allegiance to Britain. He refuses to do it. He is thrown back in prison and unfortunately ends up dying of the typhoid fever in the British prison. Now, interestingly enough, when it comes time to bury Yisroel ben Moshe, he is buried almost in his own place, not in the Jewish cemetery of London, because of fear that his grave might be defamed. And therefore, he has basically, we won't even call it necessarily, he has a Jewish burial, but he's not buried with anyone, not with any other Jew, not with any other non-Jew. He's buried in its own place to protect his grave from being defamed at that time. Now, one last point, and then we'll open up to questions. What was the reaction in general of the Brits, of the British, when news came of this very famous George Gordon turning Yisroel ben Avraham. So needless to say, it was met with much anti-Semitism. This is a picture from one of the periodicals in Britain at that time. You have one of the names that he is referred to, the Birmingham Moses. You see these dogs are biting at him. By the way, I don't want to be too crude here, but this dog is, so to speak, they're making fun of the circumcision. We'll just put it that way. This is the type of things that appeared in British newspapers at the time. And if we go down here, they're, Lord George riot made a Jew. They say that, he hid out to try and, the whole reason he became Jewish was to hide out from being arrested. And you have, again, making fun of his circumcision. And just many other pictures of him, him being fed the kosher food, to be convinced to become Jew by all the, the protocols, the Elders of Zion type thought over here. And this is how he's treated. Again, he's just made fun of in the British periodicals, made fun of for being a Jew, is not treated very well at all by the British. And, it's out and out anti-Semitism. That's what he is met with. One of the lines that appears in one of the periodicals is Lord George riot, suffering a clipping in order to become a Jew. That's how he was treated, with tremendous anti-Semitism. But again, we see from all of his actions that his conversion to Judaism, that he was very much a Ger Tzedek. It might not have been as hard to be a Jew in Protestant England as it was in Catholic Poland, like we talked about last week for the Ger Tzedek. But needless to say, he did not have it easy, and he definitely lived those last few years as a Jew, sanctifying God's name, and ended up dying sanctifying God's name as a Jew. And that is the story of Yisroel ben Avraham, of George Gordon, the British politician, the British nobleman who converted to Judaism. Okay, with no further ado, we're going to open the floor up to questions. You can either put them in the chat box, or you can unmute yourself and announce them. Can I please explain the Protocols of the Elders of Zion reference? So the Protocols of the Elders of Zion is an old book from Russia. I believe it came out in the year 1900 or thereabouts, which told of a fictitious council called the Elders of Zion that essentially control the whole world. And it was just spreading the anti-Semitic canard that Jews control everything, that Jews control the world, Jews control government, Jews control the economy. And this was a book that infiltrated every corner of the terrible anti-Semites of the world. It heavily influenced Hitler, Yamach Shemo. It heavily influenced Henry Ford. Henry Ford used to give out a free copy of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which was this book when you would buy a Ford car. So while his goal was to democratize the automobile, he used the Ford dealerships across the country to also democratize the ideas of anti-Semitism found in the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. One interesting aside about the Protocols of the Elders of Zion is there's one country, at least at the time of World War II, that took a totally different approach than Hitler, Yamach Shemo, than Henry Ford, than the great anti-Semites of history, and that is Japan. That we know that Japan was part of the Axis. They were an ally of Hitler, but they did not agree with Hitler with his treatment of the Jews. And we saw that Jews lived in peace under Japanese rule. The biggest proof of this is the famous story of Shanghai, which we could really dedicate a whole class to the story of Shanghai. But there were upwards of 30,000 Jewish refugees that survived in Shanghai during World War II, which was under Japanese control. The whole Mir Yeshiva, the great Mir Yeshiva that exists now in Jerusalem and in New York, survived intact in Shanghai. Many great leaders survived intact in Shanghai. And the reason for that is because of what was called the Fugu Plan. Now, for those of you who eat Japanese food, you might know that fugu is the Japanese word for the blowfish. And from what I understand, it's not kosher. It's not a kosher fish. But the Japanese blowfish is a delicacy if prepared properly, but it is toxic if it is not prepared properly and can kill you. So the Japanese looked at the philosophy of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion and said, well, the Jews are the fugu, the Jews are the blowfish. If we deal with them properly, if we prepare them properly, then they'll be great for our government and great for our country and great for our economy because they're running the world and we'll be allies with them and they'll be here in our country. But if you don't deal with them properly, then they're toxic. So that was sort of the inverse of the protocols the elders designed, which was not usually the case that anti-Semites took. They usually took it as a excuse to, beat up on some good old Jews. So that's the protocols the elders designed reference. And that was used very much to say why Gordon converted Judaism, because here he was an aristocratic nobleman who was just influenced by the protocols the elders designed, by the Jews trying to feed him kosher food to get him to be a Jew. Okay. Any other questions at this point? Okay, so as usual, when there's not a lot of questions, either I explained this so thoroughly, so clearly that you're just left with no questions at all, or I totally confused everybody, and therefore you just can't wait for this session to end. Okay, whichever one it is, be it as it may. Next week we will have our seventh and final session of true religion, of the righteous converts to Judaism. And we'll talk about Warner Crescent, the first American consul to Israel, a fascinating story, which for those of you who are at the Partners in Torah dinner, not 2 years ago, but 3 years ago when Michael Medved spoke, in his words, he actually told a bit of the story of Warner Crescent. So we're going to go more into that in depth next week to wrap up the Righteous Convert series. And then the following week, we will begin our session on the series called 10 Steps to the New You, based on the 10 Paths to God by Rabbi Jonathan Sachs. We're going to be covering the topics of identity, prayer, study, mitzvahs, tzedakah, chesed, faith, Israel, Kiddush Hashem, meaning sanctifying God, and responsibility. Each session will have some content from Rabbi Sachs, olav shalom, and we will also hear from noted famous rabbis in each session who will participate in each session with us. We've reached out to 10 of the most prominent rabbis in America today, and we're going to have them speak on each one of the 10 topics as part of the session. And then we will be able to have a conversation about these topics. So that'll be our next session beginning not next week, but the following week. And look forward to some more information about that. In the meantime, I will wish everybody a wonderful week, and I will look forward to seeing you right back here next week. Everybody take care.
Thank you.
Thank you, Robert.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.